There is a portfolio they never taught you. It doesn't fluctuate, it doesn't crash, and the moment you activate it, money reorganizes itself to find you. The economy has never been your provider, yet most people live as though it were a parent they must obey, fear, and wait upon. From childhood, the collective mind is trained into a quiet agreement that markets rise and fall with authority, that systems grant or deny permission, and that cycles dictate when one is allowed to prosper. This is not a harmless belief. It is a hypnosis, subtle, inherited, and rarely questioned. The moment you accept that wealth is decided outside of you, you surrender authorship of your life to appearances, and appearances, by their nature, are only effects, never causes. Neville Goddard shattered this illusion with a revelation so simple, it escaped the intellect of the masses. The world is not an independent force acting upon you, but a shadow cast by assumption. What you see, experience, and call the economy is not an external machine grinding away at your fate. It is consciousness pushed out, animated by belief, and sustained by agreement. When the assumption changes, the shadow must follow. There is no exception to this law, no matter how convincing the headlines appear or how loudly statistics argue. The economy does not move first, consciousness does. This is why Neville spoke of imagination not as a tool you occasionally pick up, but as a living creator that grows what it feeds. Imagination is not neutral, it is reproductive. Whatever you consistently entertain, whether fear, lack, security, or abundance, is being nurtured like a seed in fertile soil. The mistake most people make is treating imagination as something they use, rather than something they are living inside of. They try to manipulate outcomes while remaining loyal to an inner state that contradicts their desire. And then they wonder why effort feels heavy and results feel delayed. Here we must make a distinction that has been almost entirely forgotten: the difference between dead assets and living assets. Dead assets are external, dependent, and decaying. They require protection, permission, and favorable conditions to survive. They wait. Living assets are internal, reproductive, and self-protecting. They multiply on their own. A bank account, a job title, or a market position is inert without consciousness animating it. In contrast, an assumption once accepted works day and night without supervision. One can lose money and remain wealthy, or possess money and remain poor, because wealth is not stored in things. It is stored in states. This understanding was not unique to Neville. Long before the language of manifestation entered popular culture, thinkers like Napoleon Hill observed that riches begin as organized consciousness before taking form. The outer accumulation was never the starting point. It was the echo. Yet most people reverse the order, waiting for conditions to change so they can feel secure. Instead of feeling secure, so conditions must reorganize. They attempt to manage effects while ignoring causes, and then call the struggle reality. What you are about to be shown is not a list of things to acquire, protect, or speculate on. It is a revelation of a true portfolio, one that functions in any economy, under any system, and during any cycle. These assets cannot be frozen, taxed, inflated away, or collapsed by policy. They are alive, they attract form to themselves effortlessly, because life responds to life. Once you understand this, the fear dissolves, the noise loses its authority, and the economy quietly returns to its proper role: a mirror, not a master. For most people, wealth has been reduced to an inventory, a static collection of objects and numbers that must be guarded, monitored, and defended against loss. Houses, accounts, contracts, positions, all treated as if they possess power in themselves. Yet the strange contradiction persists. Two people can hold the same assets, live under the same economic conditions, and experience radically different outcomes. One multiplies with ease, the other struggles endlessly. This alone should signal that the source of wealth is not located where most have been trained to look. External things do not create, they respond. Dead assets are called dead, not because they lack usefulness, but because they lack life. They do not initiate movement. They do not reproduce on their own. They sit idle, waiting for favorable circumstances, proper timing, and constant intervention. Remove attention, belief, or confidence, and they deteriorate. A fortune held by a fearful consciousness shrinks. An opportunity placed in doubtful hands collapses. These assets are dependent by nature because they borrow their vitality from the inner state of the one holding them. Without that state, they are inert. Living assets function by an entirely different principle. They are not objects but states, not possessions but positions of consciousness. They do not wait for permission from the world, because the world reorganizes around them automatically. A living asset multiplies because it carries assumption within it, and assumption is creative. This is why Neville insisted that states are the only reality. A state once entered reproduces itself effortlessly through behavior, perception, timing, and encounter. You do not force outcomes from a state. You experience them as consequences. The difference can be understood through a simple analogy. A warehouse full of seeds feeds no one. It looks impressive, valuable, and secure, yet it produces nothing while it remains stored. The moment a seed is planted, however, it enters a living process. It breaks open, roots itself invisibly, and multiplies without supervision. Dead assets resemble stored seeds, potential without expression. Living assets are planted assumptions. Once embedded, they grow according to their nature. The harvest does not depend on vigilance, but on the life already contained within the seed. This distinction reframes wealth entirely. Wealth is no longer something you hold and hope to keep. It is something you occupy and allow to express. When wealth is understood as a state, fear loses its grip because states are not threatened by appearances. Markets may fluctuate, systems may strain, and structures may decay, yet the one who lives from a fertile state experiences continuity. The outer world adjusts, sometimes quietly, sometimes dramatically, but always faithfully. What you are does not wait on conditions. Conditions wait on what you are. Everything that comes into your life first passes through the gate of identity. Long before money appears as numbers, opportunities, or agreements, it appears as a quiet inner decision about who you are allowed to be. Identity is not a label you wear in public. It is the name you answer to in private, the position you occupy when no one is watching. Life responds to this inner name with astonishing precision. It does not negotiate, and it does not hesitate. It simply arranges itself to match the role you have already accepted. Self-concept gives identity its texture and tone. Two individuals may both claim to desire wealth, yet one carries an inner image of ease, entitlement, and continuity, while the other secretly identifies with struggle, uncertainty, and conditional worth. The world cannot help but reflect this difference. Circumstances treat you according to the self-concept you are loyal to, not the affirmations you repeat or the goals you announce. What feels natural to you becomes normal to life. What feels foreign is kept at a distance until it is accepted inwardly. Expectation is the silent partner that completes this triad. It is the emotional forecast you carry into each moment, the unspoken assumption about how things tend to work out for you. Expectation does not demand, it anticipates. And because it anticipates, it directs attention, behavior, and perception without force. When expectation is rooted in abundance, outcomes arrive with a sense of familiarity, almost as if they were always on their way. When expectation is rooted in lack, even gifts are met with suspicion, delay, or self-sabotage. These three assets, identity, self-concept, and expectation, operate together as a single living mechanism. Once aligned, they attract without effort because they are not reaching outward. They are broadcasting inward agreement. This is why Neville emphasized the importance of assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled rather than striving for it. Acceptance precedes evidence. When identity settles into a new state, attention naturally follows it, drawn not by discipline, but by interest. And it is attention once focused that becomes the great multiplier of wealth. Attention is the quiet force that gives life to everything it touches. It does not argue, persuade, or coerce. It simply animates. Wherever attention rests, energy flows, and whatever receives that energy begins to develop according to its nature. This is why two people can stand before the same circumstances and experience entirely different realities. One feeds possibility, the other feeds limitation, not by intention but by where their attention habitually lingers. Focus gives attention direction and continuity. Scattered attention produces scattered results, not as punishment, but as correspondence. When focus is fragmented, life reflects fragmentation through inconsistency, interruption, and unfinished outcomes. When focus becomes steady, reality begins to organize itself in coherent patterns. This is not a matter of strain or concentration, but of interest. Focus follows what identity values, and once identity has shifted, focus no longer feels forced. It becomes natural to dwell on what aligns with the state you occupy. Selectivity is the often overlooked refinement of attention. Not everything deserves nourishment, and not every thought is worthy of continuation. Life grows what is consistently selected, not what briefly appears. Just as a garden thrives through intentional cultivation, consciousness flourishes through discrimination. Selectivity does not resist or suppress, it simply declines to invest. Over time, what is ignored withers, and what is attended to strengthens, without conflict or struggle. The ancient analogy holds true. Sunlight does not argue with the seed, it simply nourishes whatever it touches. Attention functions the same way. It does not correct, fix, or persuade circumstances. It feeds them. When attention is consistently placed on states of sufficiency, continuity, and ease, those states deepen and stabilize. Sustained attention gradually condenses into conviction, and conviction, once formed, no longer requires effort to maintain. It becomes a settled inner knowing, preparing the ground for assumption to take full authority. Conviction is born the moment inner dialogue reaches agreement with a state and stops negotiating with appearances. It is not loud, dramatic, or emotional. It is settled. Conviction feels like finality, like a decision that no longer requires reinforcement. When conviction is present, circumstances are no longer evaluated for permission or confirmation. They are observed as temporary arrangements, adjusting themselves to an inner verdict that has already been issued. Inner speech is the medium through which conviction is maintained. Long before words are spoken aloud, they are spoken inwardly, and these inward conversations establish the tone of reality. Life listens to the voice you use when you are alone. It responds to the assumptions hidden in casual inner remarks, quiet reactions, and unguarded interpretations. When inner speech consistently affirms a state, without argument or explanation, that state solidifies. Outer conditions comply not because they are persuaded, but because they must reflect the dominant inner narrative. Assumption is the authority behind both conviction and inner speech. It is not hope or belief in the emotional sense, it is acceptance. To assume is to live from the end without effort, as though the matter were already decided. Neville emphasized that assumption, once accepted, has creative power regardless of appearances. The world does not test assumptions, it expresses them. Resistance only appears when the assumption is incomplete, still competing with old agreements held within consciousness. The analogy is precise. A verdict spoken inwardly needs no debate outwardly. Once judgment is rendered, the sentence is carried out automatically. Conviction eliminates the need for constant mental correction because it closes the case. Inner speech then becomes consistent, natural, and unforced, reinforcing the assumption without strain. As this inner alignment stabilizes, imagination gains clarity and strength, no longer pulled between possibilities but directed deliberately. Conviction, once formed, becomes the foundation upon which imagination operates with precision and ease. If this is reshaping how you see wealth and reality, subscribe now. Stay aligned with teachings that keep consciousness, not the economy, in control. Imagination is the womb in which all experience is formed, yet its power is often misunderstood because it operates quietly and without spectacle. It does not announce creation, it assumes it. When imagination is engaged deliberately, it does not strain to picture outcomes or force detail into place. It simply accepts a scene as real enough to be lived inwardly. The moment imagination feels like reality, rather than fantasy, creation is already underway, even if no outer sign has appeared. Feeling is what gives imagination its generative force. Thought alone sketches the outline, but feeling breathes life into it. Feeling is not emotion in the dramatic sense. It is the sense of reality, the quiet recognition that something is true. When a state is felt as real, it stops being questioned. This is why Neville insisted on feeling the wish fulfilled, rather than visualizing endlessly. Feeling seals the assumption, and once sealed, the state begins to express itself without further mental effort. Naturalness is the indicator that imagination and feeling are aligned. When a state feels natural, it no longer requires rehearsal, defense, or repetition. It settles into the background of consciousness as an accepted fact. What feels natural no longer draws attention to itself, and this is precisely why it manifests with ease. Life reflects what is assumed to be normal, not what is treated as extraordinary. The extraordinary must first become ordinary within consciousness. The analogy is exact. Water does not force the plant to grow, it makes growth inevitable. Feeling functions as this nourishing element. It does not demand results or accelerate timing. It simply creates the conditions in which expression must occur. Once imagination is infused with feeling and allowed to feel natural, persistence ceases to feel like effort. Remaining in the state becomes effortless because it is no longer something you are trying to maintain, but something you are living from. Persistence, when understood correctly, has nothing to do with strain, repetition, or mental pressure. It is not the act of pushing against doubt, nor is it the discipline of constantly correcting thought. Persistence is the natural consequence of having accepted a state as real. When a state is genuinely entered, remaining there does not feel like effort, it feels like honesty. The difficulty people associate with persistence arises only when they attempt to hold a state they have not yet accepted inwardly. In such cases, persistence feels like pretending. When acceptance is present, persistence becomes a quiet continuity. Faithfulness gives persistence its depth. To be faithful to a state is to remain inwardly aligned with it, regardless of external feedback. This does not mean denying appearances or arguing with circumstances. It means refusing to let them redefine who you are. Faithfulness is not blind optimism. It is loyalty to an inner knowing that does not require evidence to remain intact. The outer world is always rearranging itself, but faithfulness keeps consciousness anchored while that rearrangement unfolds. Without faithfulness, identity fluctuates, and results appear sporadically rather than continuously. Loyalty to state completes this triad by stabilizing identity over time. A state that is visited occasionally produces occasional outcomes. A state that is inhabited becomes a permanent reference point. Loyalty does not require constant monitoring of thoughts. It expresses itself through the absence of inner contradiction. Reactions soften, interpretations shift, and responses align naturally with the state because they arise from it. What once required conscious effort becomes automatic. The state begins to think, feel, and respond through you. This loyalty reveals why Neville placed such emphasis on remaining faithful to the end. The end is not a future event, but a present identity. When loyalty is established, the mind no longer oscillates between alternatives. Doubt may pass through awareness, but it is no longer believed. Appearances may suggest delay, but they are not consulted for instruction. The state remains intact because it has become familiar, and familiarity is the gateway to naturalness. The compass analogy captures this perfectly. A compass does not react emotionally to mountains, detours, or rough terrain. It does not question the validity of its direction because the landscape looks uncooperative. It simply continues to point north. Loyalty to state functions the same way. The outer path may twist and turn, yet direction remains stable. This stability allows timing to reorganize itself without interference. When the inner position is fixed, life adjusts the sequence, the pacing, and the means automatically. Persistence, faithfulness, and loyalty are living assets because they protect the state from erosion. They do not create through effort, they create through continuity. A state sustained long enough becomes self-reinforcing, generating its own evidence. What began as assumption becomes experience, and what becomes experience strengthens the assumption further. In this way, the state closes the loop on itself, no longer requiring willpower or discipline. It lives, and because it lives, it reproduces. Timing is one of the most misunderstood aspects of manifestation because it appears to operate independently of consciousness. From the surface, events seem to arrive late, early, or not at all, and this creates the illusion that time is an external force acting upon us. Yet Neville's revelation dissolves this illusion completely. Time does not move on its own. It responds. What appears as delay is not punishment or randomness. It is a signal that an inner state is still reorganizing itself. Timing is not something that must be endured or manipulated. It is something that unfolds as a consequence of inner alignment. Patience emerges naturally once this relationship is understood. When timing is no longer feared, patience ceases to feel like waiting in uncertainty. It becomes a state of composure, a quiet confidence that nothing essential can be missed. Patience is not passive, nor is it a virtue practiced through effort. It is the absence of inner conflict. When consciousness is no longer split between desire and doubt, the nervous urgency that demands immediate proof dissolves. What remains is steadiness, and steadiness is what allows timing to arrange itself without interference. The appointed hour, as Neville described it, is not a mystical exception, but a law. Every assumption carries within it its own moment of expression. That moment cannot be forced forward, nor can it be permanently delayed. The interval between assumption and fulfillment is not empty time. It is a period of internal adjustment. During this interval, identity sheds incompatible beliefs, reactions soften, and perception realigns. The world appears unchanged, yet beneath the surface, relationships, circumstances, and opportunities are repositioning themselves to match the new state. This is why impatience often destabilizes outcomes. When urgency is introduced, it signals that the state is not yet fully accepted. Urgency attempts to extract results from a state that has not matured. In doing so, it fractures attention and reopens negotiation with appearances. Timing responds immediately to this instability by stretching, fragmenting, or looping. What feels like delay is often the echo of inner oscillation. When the oscillation ceases, timing resumes its natural flow. The analogy of an appointment reveals this law with precision. Once an appointment is set, the day does not resist it. Activities before and after reorganize themselves automatically. You do not spend the day forcing the clock to move. You simply move within the structure the appointment creates. In the same way, an assumed state establishes an appointment with experience. Life rearranges conversations, encounters, and sequences to fulfill that agreement. You may not see the adjustments as they occur, but their effect is unmistakable when the moment arrives. Patience, in this context, is not something you practice. It is something you experience when you trust the appointment. The mind relaxes because it no longer feels responsible for managing outcomes. This relaxation is not indifference. It is alignment. When alignment is present, the state no longer leaks energy through worry or anticipation. It holds itself together. And a state that holds together long enough becomes the dominant reference point for reality. Timing resolves itself most cleanly when awareness is rooted in completion rather than anticipation. When the state feels whole, self-sufficient, and real in the present, it no longer asks when. The question disappears because the need for confirmation has dissolved. This is the moment when the appointed hour is near, though it may not announce itself. Events often arrive quietly, naturally, and with a sense of inevitability, as though they were always part of the landscape. In this way, time bends not through effort, but through coherence. Consciousness that is unified within itself exerts a gravitational pull on experience. Opportunities align, delays dissolve, and sequences accelerate or decelerate as needed to match the state. The appointed hour arrives because it must. Once the state is stable, time has no option but to comply. There is a depth of consciousness where effort dissolves and creation becomes impression rather than action. Neville called this depth the state akin to sleep, not because it is unconscious, but because it exists beyond strain, beyond argument, and beyond the restless management of thought. In this state, the mind is no longer busy defending, correcting, or anticipating. It is receptive, and receptivity is the condition through which assumptions are most easily impressed upon reality. Inner stillness is what allows this state to open naturally. Stillness is not silence in the external sense, nor is it the absence of thought. It is the cessation of inner resistance. When stillness is present, thought no longer pulls consciousness in competing directions. Attention gathers itself inwardly, and imagination becomes vivid without effort. This is why Neville emphasized sats as the gateway to creation. It is not a technique layered on top of life. It is a return to the condition in which life is shaped. In waking consciousness, the mind tends to argue with itself. It evaluates, doubts, compares, and reconsiders. In sats, that argumentative quality softens. The critical faculties relax, not because they are suppressed, but because they are no longer needed. The state feels real enough to be lived inwardly, and this sense of reality is what impresses the subconscious. What is impressed here does not need repetition through force. It sinks in because the soil is receptive. Stillness functions like clear water. When water is agitated, it distorts reflection. Shapes blur, edges waver, and depth becomes unreadable. When water is still, it reflects accurately without effort. Consciousness behaves the same way. In agitation, imagination struggles to feel real. In stillness, even a simple assumption carries weight. This is why outcomes impressed in ersatz often unfold with a sense of inevitability. They were received, not imposed. Ersatz is also where the distinction between effort and inevitability becomes unmistakable. In this state, you do not try to believe. Belief happens organically. You do not force feeling. Feeling emerges as recognition. The body relaxes, the breath slows, and awareness turns inward, not to escape the world, but to seed it. What is accepted here does not remain confined to imagination. It moves outward through bridges of incident that appear natural, unremarkable, and perfectly timed. Inner stillness protects the living assets already discussed. Identity settles here. Attention becomes unified. Conviction deepens without reinforcement. Timing aligns without urgency. Ersatz is not separate from these assets. It is the environment in which they synchronize. When stillness is present, the assets stop operating as individual components and begin functioning as a single coherent state. And coherence is what reality responds to most faithfully. This is why economic noise loses its authority in stillness. Fear is loud, stillness is quiet. Yet the quiet always overrides the loud because it carries certainty without argument. In ersatz, the idea of lack cannot sustain itself because it requires tension to exist. Stillness dissolves that tension, leaving only what feels natural and real, and what feels natural here becomes normal there. Sats and inner stillness are living assets because they allow reality to be impressed rather than pursued. They do not chase outcomes, they receive them. When consciousness learns to rest here, creation becomes gentle, precise, and self-organizing. The world reflects what was calmly accepted, not what was anxiously demanded. In this state, wealth is not attracted through effort, but through resonance. The economy, like all external systems, simply responds. Tend the living and the dead will serve you. The economy has never been an authority in your life, although it has often appeared to be one. This appearance is convincing only when consciousness forgets itself and looks outward for permission. When awareness is anchored internally, the economy reveals its true function. It is a mirror, not a master. It reflects assumptions faithfully, without intention or intelligence of its own. Fear arises only when reflections are mistaken for causes. Once this confusion dissolves, the noise of markets, systems, and cycles loses its emotional charge. Because echoes cannot command the source from which they originate, living assets operate by a law that external systems cannot access or override. They are not maintained through vigilance or control, but through being. Because they are states of consciousness, they protect themselves automatically. They multiply because assumption is inherently reproductive, and they summon form because life must externalize what is internally organized. What is alive within you cannot be seized, frozen, or diminished by circumstance, and what flows from it arrives with a smoothness that effort could never replicate. External wealth becomes a byproduct rather than a pursuit. This understanding aligns with the insight expressed by William Blake, who observed that, as a man is, so he sees. Perception is not a passive window onto reality. It is an active, organizing principle. Supply, opportunity, and timing are arranged according to the state you inhabit. When consciousness is ordered, life reflects order. When consciousness is abundant, channels of supply appear without struggle. The world does not argue with perception, it arranges itself around it. Narratives of collapse, instability, and scarcity derive their power from collective identification with external structures. Yet history reveals a consistent pattern. Systems rise and fall, while consciousness endures. Structures decay because they are temporary expressions. States persist because they are creative sources. Those who place their security in systems inherit anxiety. Those who place it in states inherit continuity. Stability has never belonged to structures. It has always belonged to awareness. Ersatz reveals ownership in its most refined form. Ownership here is not possession, but identification. When inner assets are felt as already owned, there is nothing to grasp for, and nothing to defend. This quiet ownership reorganizes experience naturally. Form follows without urgency, and outcomes arrive through ordinary paths that carry extraordinary accuracy. When consciousness is wealthy, life has no alternative but to comply. This is not motivation or belief, it is law. Tend what is alive within you, and what appears dead, external, or conditional will inevitably rearrange itself to serve that life.